Hello everyone, Ace here, and today let's talk a little bit more about short Fat Otaku AKA Dev. Why, you may ask? Well, it's because he has managed to produce yet more proof of his continuing mental decline, to the point that he can't even produce a visual capable of illustrating his arguments anymore. Case in point, this little graph he decided to create to explain why he has changed on so many subjects. As you could probably tell just by looking at its surface, this graph is completely incoherent. And what it suggests, just from the information from the graph itself, is that MAGA has always been the good guys, the far left have always been the bad guys, but things have been steadily getting worse in the world. Now, credit where credit is due, that MAGA has been the comparative good guys and the far left are absolutely evil. The past decade has fundamentally proven that. As far as things getting constantly and steadily worse, I do have to take contention with that. On the one hand, yes, wokeness has been a consistent and ever-growing problem, up until relatively recently, that is. However, there are plenty of other major issues I could readily cite as making other previous years worse, despite wokeness itself becoming a bigger issue as time went on. The lockdowns being a prime example, and the inflation caused by the lockdowns, which itself peaked in 2022. I could point to various riots, I could point to military disasters, I could point to a number of things. So the idea that things have been steadily getting worse rather than it being up and down, yeah, that makes this graph inaccurate on its own. But of course, the idea that Dev was trying to argue that MAGA is not as bad as the left, well, anyone that knows what Dev's political positions are knows for a fact that's not what he was trying to argue at all. And so when this graph was presented to the public, it resulted in some confusion, which resulted in Dev having to explain his graph. You know, the graph that was meant to be an easy visual explanation as to why he changed his positions on so many different subjects. The sheer fact that Dev did have to do this, and make no mistake, he absolutely did have to do this, even if you know Dev's political takes, this graph is utterly incoherent, but the sheer fact that he had to explain his explanation shows that the graph is fundamentally a failure at what it was intended to do, provide an easy explanation as to why he changed on so many subjects. For the record, what he is trying to say is that MAGA has been consistently more optimistic about the world, and the far left have been consistently more pessimistic about the world, while things have been steadily getting worse, suggesting that the left is more accurate in their assessments, at least at the current time. The issues are numerous though, in that this graph and Dev's take simply do not mesh with reality. Are we seriously going to believe that MAGA was as every bit optimistic about the world circa 2022 as they were, say, 2017? No, that's frankly ridiculous, but that's what the graph suggests. Are we going to even argue that MAGA was as optimistic about the world in 2022 as the left were at that point? You know, the left that were of the opinion they could just arrest all their political opposition at that stage, that they could push their political opinions on literally any piece of media they wanted, that the entire world was going to bend to their way of thinking. No, clearly the left were more optimistic about things in 2022 than the right. And frankly, it is no big surprise that the optimism of MAGA and the fears of the far left fluctuated depending in some degrees on who exactly was in power at that time. Point is, the lines representing MAGA and the far left fly completely in the face of what MAGA and the far left actually thought of the world at various different points. Dev obviously should know this. Now, the obvious answer is that Dev is just being lazy here with his little graph, and no doubt there is some truth to that. But the idea was that this was supposed to be a graph that was easy to understand for the average person, that was supposed to be coherent and provide a ready explanation for why Dev has changed on so many of his stances. The simple fact of the matter is that it fails to do that, and even with Dev's explanation, this graph fails to make sense. Heck, taking a look at what Dev thinks is the reality line, it leads one to wonder why he believes that we should side with the Obama and Biden administrations as being the lesser evils to Trump, when under their administrations things were getting worse at a consistently steady rate to the Trump administration. In Dev's eyes, apparently, there was no no change of pace of how fast things were getting worse, regardless of who was in power. It's actually a rather defeatist way of looking at it. Apparently, Dev thinks that no matter who you vote for, things are going to get equally worse no matter what. And if that's the case, it really makes you wonder why he's bothering to cover politics at all at that stage. Nothing ever changes, and it's always going to get equally worse anyways. Once Dev provides his explanation, this graph suggests that he thinks the West has fallen. Billions must die. Which I don't seriously believe is what he actually intends, even when he provides his little explanation. It's just that the graph was that poorly done, that even after he provides the explanation, it makes him look that way. And don't forget, he's also essentially arguing with this graph that things were better during the lockdowns than they are now. That he would rather return to the lockdowns than live in the present. Which is obviously a ridiculous thing for him to argue, but that's unironically how he drew the graph. At no point did he think to himself, maybe making all these straight lines with no changes is a bad idea that undermines his entire position. But that does lead me to the main thrust of my argument here, one that I have already spoke of earlier but is still very much worth repeating. Dev's little graph here is not the work of a sane man. It is not the work of a rational man, and it is not the work of an intelligent man. Remember, he originally created this graph itself as an explanation to people as to why he's changed his position on so many different subjects. To him, this little graph is instantly understandable, instantly relatable, and that as wide an audience as possible would easily be able to get it. Whereas to absolutely everyone else, it's simply an incoherent mess that does not mesh with how things are actually going on. And that's entirely because Dev's brain is simply fried. He has lost what rational thought he had prior and runs more on raw emotions than anything else. He acts more out of sheer desperation to try to get a win on those he declared his enemies, rather than seriously try to understand the situation strategically at all. He fails to consider his consistent and blatant hypocrisy, which has made it ever easier for people to point out when he's just lying through his teeth, which seems to be more and more frequent these days. And it seems that roughly half of his time spent on the weekly seeds is just him desperately coping about his own ever-declining situation, as reality ever slowly surrounds and suffocates him. Every day he becomes increasingly unhinged and insane. To say that he is spiraling now is an understatement, at least as far as his mental health is concerned. And the failure of this graph, I would argue, is prime evidence of exactly that. Dev thought this graph was rational. To him, this graph was coherent. It was his way of making his position easy for everyone to understand. It did not, to him, look like the insane ramblings of someone that is completely out of touch with reality. That is how far the disconnect has truly become.